Welcome to the Civic Media Center's presentation of Noam Chomsky. As a courtesy to your fellow patrons and visiting artists, we ask at this time that you silence and reduce screen brightness on all electronic devices. Flash photography is strictly prohibited for this performance. There will be a brief question and answer period immediately following Dr. Chomsky. Thank you, and please enjoy.
Welcome, everyone, to the Curtis M. Phillips, M.D. Center for the Performing Arts. I'm Robbie Zopek. I'm the coordinator for the Civic Media Center, the CMC. The CMC is Gainesville's independent library of the alternative and non-corporate press, a community organizing space, and a space for political and cultural events. 20 years ago, our founders opened the doors of our first location with tonight's speaker on hand for the dedication. 10 years ago, Chomsky came again at the urging of the CMC for our 10th anniversary. Tonight, by bringing Chomsky once again, we celebrate our 20th anniversary. This Friday, we will celebrate the actual date of our 20th anniversary of grassroots community organizing with a block party at the Civic Media Center, 433 South Main Street, from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. And then on Saturday at 8 p.m., there's a poetry-based celebration of our 20th anniversary, also at the Civic Media Center. We have film screenings every Monday at 7 p.m., open mic poetry every Thursday at 9 p.m., and talks, lectures, workshops, and music shows throughout the week. We are also the home of the Radical Press Coffee Collective, which, as you may know, is Gainesville's vegan workers' cooperative coffee shop. At our table in the lobby, there are flyers for some great upcoming events, CMC brochures, and there's also a sign-up sheet to get you all on our weekly events email list. The Civic Media Center is proud to have been the driving force behind bringing Noam Chomsky to town. However, we couldn't have done it without a lot of community and campus help and support. First off, we'd like to thank all the hardworking folks here at the Phillips Center who on short notice have been fantastic partners. Also, I'd like to give a great big thank you to Target Copy for donating the printing of tonight's programs. Tonight's overflow sound system is courtesy of Celestial Sound. Of course, I need to recognize our hardworking Civic Media Center board members, past and present. Will you please stand up, board members past and present? I'd also like to thank our volunteers and interns, past and present. Will you also please stand up? And then, of course, we thank our members and our financial supporters. Will our members and financial supporters please raise their hands? You are all the people who make the Civic Media Center possible. Please be sure to read your programs, to see all the departments, campus and community organizations, and individuals too numerous to name who assisted with tonight's event. Finally, I'd like to introduce Candy Herrera, a CMC member and a member of Graduate Assistants United, GAU, who has been incredibly helpful in our efforts to bring Chomsky this evening. Candy lobbied Joe Corder for over 2 years to help coordinate this event and get to meet Noam Chomsky in person. Now, let's welcome Candy Herrera to the stage, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Hello, everyone. So my comments are going to be brief for two reasons. For one, you certainly didn't come here to see me. And for two, there is no introduction that I could give that would adequately describe the contributions that Noam Chomsky has given to the world. So what I'm going to do is, as advised by Joe Corder, director of the CMC, is to speak from my heart, because that's really all I can offer. Sometime in the winter of 2009, I, as a matter of happenstance, decided to pick up Latin America from Colonization to Globalization, a collection of conversations between Noam Chomsky and Heinz Diedrich, a sociologist based out of Mexico. To be completely frank, this is the book that changed my life. At the time, I honestly thought that I'd wanted to go to law school and specialize in immigration law. While I understood that the immigration system in the United States was long and complicated, and I knew that the U.S. had had some intervention in Latin American politics, I had no idea the extent to which the two were closely intertwined. So it was Chomsky and Diedrich's book that helped me understand the true depths to which Cuba, Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Brazil, and my native country of Chile, among many, many other countries in the global south and throughout the rest of the world, had experienced U.S.-American terrorism. To be sure, the talons of the eagle had driven themselves far deeper than I had ever been taught. It was a long struggle against my own psychic resistance, but with this understanding also came the dissolution of the shame I felt being from a poor immigrant family, the majority of my life having been spent sin papeles, without papers, that is, as an undocumented person. I began to realize that there is no shame in being the byproduct of global capitalism, of being disenfranchised, and very importantly, of my race and ethnicity. There were and continue to be major economic and socio-political reasons for why I was in the situation that I was in, and Noam Chomsky's worldwide activism and public talks like the one he's giving tonight helped me realize this. While the fact that I am currently finishing up my master's degree in Latin American Studies is due exclusively to Noam Chomsky, I'd like to point out the fact that there's a certain irony that someone who has yet to publish a single scholarly article in her entire career is introducing the most cited academic author in the entire world. But I realized my ultimate path in life is not as an academic. It's as an organizer. And this is, again, thanks to Noam Chomsky. I think he's okay with that. The reason why is because I've come to understand that change isn't affected by armchair bloviations about the state of the world, but by getting out and actually doing something about it. Joining and taking an active role in your union and going to Central Labor Council meetings, second Monday of every month, joining a community organization like Vets for Peace, Students for a Democratic Society, Industrial Workers of the World, National Women's Liberation, the Alachua County Labor Party, Dream Defenders, or my own group, the Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice, is absolutely critical for continuing the fight. One quick way to get involved is by coming to the CLC demonstration tomorrow outside of Congressman Yoho's office at 5:15, demanding that he end the government shutdown. I hope to see all of you there. It'd be great. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with my utmost pride that I get to say to you, as a formerly undocumented Latina, as a proud union member of UFGAU Local 7463, as an extremely grateful activist, ladies and gentlemen, Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is to consider some events that are important enough so that they're on the front pages daily, regularly, prominently. And secondly, to consider how they appear, the events, as they pass through the prism of the media, which presents them in a certain light. And thirdly, I would like to comment on how I think they ought to appear if the population is to be able to participate in a meaningful way in influencing affairs of state, the way the society functions. That's how a democratic society is supposed to function in principle. Unfortunately, its principle is demonstrably very remote from practice. That's something that we should not tolerate, and we need not tolerate. Well, let me begin with right now. A few hours ago, Abu Anas al-Libi pleaded not guilty in a New York court to charges that were presented. It's not very clear what the charges were. Very little information's been available, and according to al-Libi's court-appointed lawyer, the charges didn't involve anything beyond some vague suggestions about things he might have done in the early 90s, and possibly a charge of surveillance of an American embassy in Kenya that was later attacked. Maybe there's more, but that's what we know now. Anyway, he pleaded not guilty. Al-Libi, as I'm sure you know, was kidnapped by an army Delta team from the capital of Libya, Tripoli, a couple of weeks ago. He was sent off to a Navy ship where he was interrogated without a lawyer. You can figure out what that means without my telling you. He was then brought to New York. Here he's to be tried on what evidence we don't know. Well, that's the basic event. There was another part to it that was interesting. If you read down to the end of the stories about it, you may have seen that Secretary of State John Kerry, who was in Indonesia, was asked in a press conference whether it was legal to kidnap someone in the capital city of another country and abscond with them and put them away and interrogate him on a Navy ship. And Kerry responded that it was perfectly legal. It was in accord with American law. and therefore it's a legitimate act. There was very little. Through the media prism, there was nothing said about this. I could find barely a comment. It was kind of mentioned and passed over. The way it ought to have been presented, I think, is with screaming front-page headlines saying that the U.S. formally declares that it is what's called a rogue state, caring nothing about international law or decent respect for the opinion of mankind, as proclaimed in the opening words of the Declaration of Independence. The reason why there should be such headlines, I think, is pretty clear. Any moral or legal principle is invalid unless it can be generalized. So, for example, in this case, unless it could be generalized, say, to Cuba, to take some cases not far from here. So if the principle's valid, then Cuba should be able to send special forces to Miami to kidnap Posada Carriles, and before him, Juan Bosch, notorious terrorists. Bosch was even accused of about 30 acts of terrorism by the FBI, and the FBI and the Department of Justice wanted him deported as a threat to American security, but President Bush #1 intervened. In fact, Cuba should have been able to, according to this principle, to send special forces to Washington to kidnap the Kennedy brothers, who we know were engaged in a major terrorist campaign against Cuba. John F. Kennedy, the president, assigned to his brother, Robert, the task of bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That was his highest priority, and he declared that the highest priority of the American government was to bring down the government of Cuba by terror and economic warfare. Continued for many years, still does. So assuming the principle can be generalized, it should cover that case. Incidentally, those are not my words and my characterization. I'm quoting from the historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was Kennedy's Latin American advisor. This is from his biography of Robert Kennedy. Or it should be extended, say, to Bolivia. They should be able to send forces to the United States to kidnap the former president, Losada, known as Goni, charged in Libya with very serious criminal acts. They've tried to extradite him for years. U.S. won't let him go. You may recall that a couple of weeks ago, the Europeans were so intimidated by the rogue state across the sea, that a couple of countries closed their borders to the president of Bolivia, Morales' presidential plane, when he was flying from Russia back home to Bolivia, because the United States thought that Edward Snowden might be there, and so therefore they blocked passage. But whatever one thinks about that, the Organization of American States bitterly condemned it. Two countries refused to join, the United States and Canada, but that's normal for rogue states. Or, for that matter, Yemeni villagers who are attacked in President Obama's drone campaign, far and away the most extreme terrorist campaign going on in the world. They should be permitted to land in Washington and kidnap President Obama. I mean, obviously, all of this is unthinkable, which simply means that we are a rogue state, and we take it for granted that we should be. The principle is we own the world, so shut up and obey. Nothing else to be said. That's what John Kerry reiterated in his comment, and that should have been screaming headlines. Actually, there are many other cases. The United States quite regularly refuses to honor requests from other countries to send back criminals who are harbored in the United States, even those who are guilty of very serious crimes. For example, during the Clinton years, Emmanuel Constant, Haitian terrorist, he was the head of the Haitian FRAP militias, which murdered about 4,000 or 5,000 Haitians during the early 90s in a major terror campaign. He was sentenced in absentia in Haiti, but Clinton refused to send him back, living happily in Queens, New York. It's speculated, not unreasonably, that the U.S. government was afraid that if he did go back, he'd spill the beans on U.S. support for the terrorist military junta in Haiti in the early years of the 90s. There's even legislation in the United States, which in Europe is called the Netherlands Invasion Act. That's an act passed by Congress, signed by the President, which authorizes the executive to send military forces to Europe, to The Hague in the Netherlands, to rescue any American who might be brought to an international court on criminal charges. Well, that's official U.S. legislation announcing our status as the world's leading rogue state, reiterated by Kerry, Secretary of State, after the al-Libi kidnapping. That's what should have been presented. What should have been added in serious media commentary, if it were imaginable, would be that what I've just said is by no means a new observation. You go back to 1999 in the major establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, a very distinguished scholar, the professor of the science of government at Harvard University, Samuel Huntington, wrote that in the eyes of much of the world, the United States is becoming the rogue superpower, considered the single greatest external threat to their societies. And he didn't think this was a good idea on pragmatic grounds. If we continue to be a rogue superpower, terrorizing the world, alienating the world, coalitions of states may form to impede us and to counter our actions, and that would not be good for us. So for those reasons, it's not a good idea. We see this happening right in front of our eyes. Today's New York Times, for example, describes the protests of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund against what's going on in Washington, which they fear may actually crash the international financial system, just as the predatory practices of New York banks and the deregulation here that allowed them to proceed practically brought down the world economy in 2008. China was quoted today in the New York Times, Chinese commentator, as saying that unless the United States learns to behave like a civilized society, the world should be de-Americanized. It should separate itself from the United States. To most of the world, China sounds like the responsible adult in the international community, certainly as compared to the really embarrassing farce that's now being enacted in Washington. But through the media prism, we are the guarantor of global security, the purest state in the world and in history. Well, this month's issue of Foreign Affairs, again, main establishment journal, has an article on U.S. unilateralism, which it is concerned about. I'll quote it. It says, "The United States Senate rejects multilateral treaties as if it were sport. Some it rejects outright, as when it voted against the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2012 and against the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1999. Others it rejects through inaction. Dozens of treaties are pending before the Senate pertaining to such subjects as labor, economic and cultural rights, endangered species, pollution, armed conflict, peacekeeping, nuclear weapons, the law of the sea, and discrimination against women. Often, presidents don't even bother pushing for ratification, since they know the odds are long. Under the U.S. Constitution, it takes only 1/3 of the Senate to reject a treaty. The United States commitment problem has grown so entrenched that foreign governments no longer expect Washington's ratification or its full participation in the institutions treaties create. The world is moving on. Laws get made elsewhere with limited, if any, American involvement. And that's the establishment speaking, not me. Okay, that's their version of what ought to appear before the public. And it continues. Rather striking is what's happening in in this hemisphere. Latin America used to be what was called the backyard. We didn't have to pay much attention to Latin America. They did what we said, period. It's our little region over here, which has never bothered anybody, as the Secretary of War said back in 1944, so we just run it. It's changed dramatically in the past 10 years. I mentioned when the Morales plane was stopped in Europe, the Latin American countries were very angry, bitterly protested. The Organization of American States used to be run by the United States, made a strong statement, condemnation of it, which wasn't published here. The U.S. and Canada rejected it. They wouldn't participate. That's been happening more and more. A couple of years ago, there was an international hemispheric conference in Colombia, Cartagena, Colombia, and it didn't issue any declarations because they have to be reached by consensus. And there were two major issues in which there was no consensus. The first issue was admitting Cuba into the hemispheric conferences. The second issue was moves to decriminalize drugs. And on those two issues, the United States and Canada, the two rogue states, simply refused to agree. So there could be no consensus. There now already is a Western Hemisphere organization, CELAC, which excludes the United States and Canada. And if things continue the way they're going, that may replace the OAS. The United States and Canada are simply being excluded from the hemisphere. And in fact, maybe the world will be de-Americanized if this continues. Another graphic illustration of this, which also was not reported, was a couple of months ago when the Open Society Forum published a long document, detailed document on rendition. The rendition, as you know, is the procedure by which the U.S., CIA, sends suspects to friendly dictators like Gaddafi and Mubarak and Assad and others, so they can be properly tortured, and maybe we'll get some information out of them. It's extraordinary rendition, it's called. And this study reviewed which countries have participated in the U.S. torture programs, export of torture programs. Well, a lot of the Middle East, of course, participated. That's where people were being sent to be tortured. Most of Europe participated. Asian countries participated. One area of the world totally refused to participate, Latin America. Now that's doubly remarkable. It's remarkable for two reasons. First, because Latin America, as I mentioned, used to do everything we told them to do. And secondly, during that period, Latin America was one of the torture capitals of the world. But now they refuse to participate in U.S.-run international torture. Well, there's quite a lot like that. The world is moving on, just as Foreign Affairs points out. Laws get made elsewhere. The United States is excluding itself from international society, apart from its virtual monopoly of force and violence, which does intimidate people, intimidates Europe, intimidates others. But that's it's not an asset that's going to last forever. Well, let's go back to the headlines. Another major issue in the headlines is Iran. According to the media version, Iran is what's called the gravest threat to world peace. Media echoing President Obama and actually the Republican opposition as well. And the story is that the international community is resolute in demanding that Iran abandon its development of nuclear weapons. The West is willing to consider Iran's recent charm offensive, as it's called, but with caution. And in fact, there are congressional resolutions initiated by one of your congressional representatives which seeks to ban any contact with Iran, or for that matter, any contact with anyone who is taken to be threatening the United States. That's a real innovation in diplomacy coming from Florida and with a lot of congressional support. Well, that's the media version. It should raise three questions in your mind right away. First of all, who exactly is the international community? Who holds this view? Secondly, what exactly is the threat that Iran poses? And thirdly, whatever the threat is, how could we proceed to deal with it? Those are questions that are barely mentioned in the massive coverage of the gravest threat to world peace. And the reason is because of the answers to them, which you can find out pretty easily. So first, who thinks Iran is the gravest threat to world peace? Well, it turns out it's a U.S. obsession shared by Israel and some of its European allies. That's about it. The non-aligned countries, which is most of the world, have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They did this again in Tehran and the meeting of the non-aligned countries a couple of months ago, but they have been doing it for years. Right nearby is the Arab world. What do they think? Well, there are regular polls of Arab public opinion taken by the leading U.S. polling agencies. It turns out that, not surprisingly, Arab public opinion dislikes Iran. Those are hostilities that go back very far, actually thousands of years. So they don't like Iran. On the other hand, they don't consider Iran a threat. They consider it they don't like it, but it's not a threat. It's a very small percentage regarded as a threat. They do perceive threats, the United States and Israel. Those are the threats that are perceived in the Arab world. Now, it's kind of interesting to see how this is reported here. What's reported here is that the Arabs support the United States, and the reference is to the Arab dictators. It's true that some of the oil dictators support the United States, not the populations who regard the U.S. as one of the gravest threats they face and don't regard Iran as a threat. But the contempt for democracy in the United States is so deeply rooted that if the dictators support us and the population opposes us, that means that the Arabs support us. Try to find an exception to this in the coverage. That's the who question, U.S. and Israel and some of its allies. Well, next question is what? What exactly is the threat supposed to be? You can get an authoritative answer to that from the highest sources. U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon give annual reports to Congress on the global security situation, all public documents, pick them up on the internet. And they, of course, have a section devoted to Iran. And what they point out is Iran's a very serious threat. They say that it's not a military threat. Iran has very limited military capacity and spending, even by the standards of the region. It's very low, certainly compared to the U.S. or Israel. It has very little capacity to deploy force. It has a strategic doctrine which is defensive, designed to deter invasion long enough for diplomacy to set in. It's been hundreds of years since Iran carried out any act of aggression, with a single exception. Under the Shah, backed by the United States, Iran in the 1970s did conquer 2 Arab islands in the Gulf, but that's it for hundreds of years. That was with U.S. support. So it's not a military threat. They, of course, talk about the possibility that Iran might develop nuclear weapons. Unlike the media, U.S. intelligence doesn't know the answer to that question. They say they might. And if they do, it would be part of their deterrent capacity. And if you think about the geopolitical situation, no matter what you think of the government of Iran, maybe it's Hitler, whatever you think, it's hard to think of any country in the world that needs a deterrent as much as Iran does. Just take a look at where it sits, surrounded by nuclear-armed states. One of them, Israel, constantly making threats to attack it, heavily nuclear-armed, and the global superpower regularly announcing its freedom to attack Iran. That's what it means when the president says all options are open. That should lead to another headline in the media. There is something called the UN Charter, which is the foundation of modern international law, which starts by saying that the threat or use of force in foreign affairs is barred. The threat or use of force. U.S. violates that daily, which makes sense for a rogue state and elicits no comment because of the tacit assumption that we have a right to be a rogue state, to rule the world by force and to intimidate the world. Well, but then intelligence goes on to say that this is a major threat. We cannot accept the threat of an Iranian deterrent. Why? Because it limits the capacity of the United States and its regional ally, Israel, to use force and violence freely. If there's a deterrent, you're less free to use violence and coercion. And for a rogue state, you cannot accept a deterrent. Just as, the Godfather won't accept any deterrent to his ability to rule his domain. That's the threat. There's also the threat of what's called destabilization. Iran is charged with trying to destabilize its neighbors. Its neighbors are Iraq and Afghanistan. How is Iran destabilizing its neighbors? It's trying to expand its commercial and political influence in its neighboring countries. That's destabilization. When we invade and destroy those countries, that's called bringing stability. I'm not joking. Take a look at not only at the media commentary, but even the scholarly literature. That's the way the term stability is used. Sometimes it becomes almost comical. One of the leading foreign affairs analysts, a very good scholar, liberal scholar, James Chase, used to be editor of Foreign Affairs. He described the U.S. participation in the overthrow of parliamentary democracy in Chile 40 years ago. First 9/11, it's called, in South America, 9/11, 1973. He said that it was a bad thing to do, he said, but it was necessary to destabilize Chile in order to bring about stability. In one sentence. And that's not a contradiction. To destabilize it means to institute a military coup which overthrows the government, kills a couple thousand people, tortures tens of thousands, and so on. That's destabilizing it. But it brings about stability, which means conformity to what we say. Do what we say. That's stability. So yes, that's normal. So that's the Iranian threat. And it's a serious threat to a rogue superpower. Well, turn to the last question, the how question. Whatever you take, this has nothing, this is kind of totally independent to what your attitude is toward the Iranian government. That the government is a threat to its own population is perfectly clear, and it's far from alone in that respect. Unfortunately, that's all too normal. But it is, and there's plenty of reason to criticize it. But we're talking about a different question. What's its threat globally? Why is it the gravest threat to world peace or to regional peace? Well, those are the answers that you can find. Let's take it to be a threat. What can you do about it? Well, there are a number of obvious suggestions. So, for example, in proper coverage of this topic in the media, these are what would be discussed. One obvious suggestion is to try to reconstitute an agreement that was reached in 2010, a couple of years ago. That's under Obama. There was an agreement reached by Turkey, Brazil, and Iran. The agreement was that Iran would ship its low-enriched uranium to Turkey for storage, so no more uranium enrichment. And in return, the West would provide Iran with isotopes for its medical reactors. When that agreement was announced, there was a bitter attack on Brazil and Turkey by President Obama, the US government, and reflexively the media. And in fact, Obama went straight to the UN to impose harsher sanctions. The foreign minister of Brazil was kind of irritated about this, and he released a letter to the press, a letter from President Obama to President da Silva Lula of Brazil, in which Obama had made exactly this suggestion. He'd suggested to Brazil to try to implement this. Presumably, he was assuming that, and his advisors were assuming, that Iran wouldn't accept it, and they'd have a propaganda point. But when Iran did accept it, they were stuck. So they had to denounce Brazil and Turkey for their impudence and impose harsher sanctions. Barely mentioned. Try to find it. You can do an internet search. Of course, it's discussed in dissident literature, like I write about it, other people write about it, but I'm talking about the mainstream. Well, that's one possibility. Maybe that could be reconstituted. Another possibility is more recent, December 2012. In last December, there was supposed to be an international conference in Finland, Helsinki, Finland. It was a part of a program within the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United Nations, to try to carry forward a proposal, an old proposal, that was the main impetus for it has been the Arab states for many years, a proposal to institute a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, a Middle East free from weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. That's the proposal. The West, including the United States, doesn't like it, but the support for it has been so overwhelming internationally that they've been forced to kind of say, yeah, good idea someday. Anyhow, there was supposed to be a conference in December, last December. Israel announced that it wasn't going to attend the conference. The next question is, what's Iran going to say? Iran announced that they would attend the conference with no conditions, unconditionally. A couple of days later, President Obama canceled the conference, providing the standard Israeli objection. Not the right time. We can't have a conference until there's a regional peace treaty. And the small footnote, there can't be a regional peace treaty until there's a resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And another footnote, there's an international consensus on that that's overwhelming on a two-state settlement, and the U.S. has been in the lead in blocking it for 35 years, and so has Israel. So they can continue to block it. There won't be a regional peace settlement, and until there is, according to this line of reasoning, there can't be steps towards imposing a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. That was last December. Immediately after Obama's cancellation of the conference, the Arab states announced that they were going to pursue it anyway, but of course they can't do anything without U.S. support. The European Parliament passed a strong resolution calling for quick reenactment, calling again of the conference. Russia supported it. There was actually a meeting in Finland, but it was of the NGOs, you know, the non-governmental organizations committed to disarmament, so they had a meeting. Well, can the American population do anything about this? In principle, yes, but there's a condition. They have to know something about it, and that's impossible. There was not one word in the American press about any of this. Try and check. Maybe I missed something, and other people who looked missed something. There were a couple of searches. We couldn't find a word about any of this. You can find it in professional journals of disarmament or professional international relations journals, you know, published in England and so on, and in dissident articles, you know, like, again, I've written about it, a couple other people. But for the general population, it's impossible to know anything about this. Therefore, they can't do anything about it. No popular movement can develop if people are completely ignorant of what's happening. Now, notice that this includes nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. That would be included, which leads to another issue, which I'll come to in a moment. But first, let's take a third way of trying to deal with the alleged Iranian threat. Now, this one gets occasional mention in the press in the last couple of months, always evading the main issue. Now, what's pointed out is that when the current President Rouhani, just elected, when he was the negotiator 10 years ago, Iran did suspend enrichment for 2 years, in fact. They stopped enriching uranium. What happened? Well, I'll read the description of it at the time by one of the leading U.S. specialists, Zelig Harrison. What he points out is the following. The nuclear negotiations between Iran and the European Union were based on a bargain that the EU, European Union, held back by the United States, has failed to honor. Iran agreed to suspend its uranium enrichment efforts pending the outcome of discussions on a permanent enrichment ban. The EU promised to put forward proposals for economic incentives and security guarantees in return for a permanent ban, but subsequently refused to discuss security issues, of course under U.S. pressure. The language of the joint declaration that launched the negotiations was unambiguous. It said a mutually acceptable agreement would not only provide objective guarantees that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively for peaceful purposes, but would equally provide firm commitments on security issues. That's a phrase that means the U.S. won't attack Iran. Well, the EU couldn't live up to its part of the bargain because the U.S. blocked it, insisting on its right to use force if it doesn't get its way, in the manner of a rogue state. Back to the early points. All of this is happening right now. Well, let's go on. Let me turn to the two more issues, also Middle East, see how they're handled. Israel-Palestine, which I mentioned, again in the front pages, and Syria, okay? Syrian chemical weapons. Israel-Palestine negotiations, there is a media version that the United States is an honest broker, earnestly seeking to reconcile recalcitrant adversaries, and universally it's claimed that there are two options. One option is the international consensus on a two-state settlement, that's well known, and the other is that Israel will take over the whole area, all of Palestine, and then there'll be what's called a demographic problem, too many Arabs in a Jewish state, and there'll be a civil rights struggle, anti-apartheid struggle. Some welcome it, some are worried about it. Now, that's the standard picture. There's a couple of problems with it. First, what about the negotiations? The United States and Israel insist on two preconditions for negotiations, and the Palestinians have been forced to accept them. One precondition is that Israel be permitted to continue to expand its settlements in the occupied territories. In fact, the U.S. stand on that is so strong that in February 2011, Obama vetoed a Security Council resolution that called for imposition of official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is that expansion of the settlements should be stopped. And when the Security Council passed a resolution to that effect, the U.S. vetoed it. That actually did receive some commentary. It was so extreme. But that's the condition, one of the conditions for the current negotiations. Now, bear in mind that the settlements themselves are illegal. There's just no question about that. Every high legal authority, every high legal authority has repeatedly determined that. The Security Council, the International Court of Justice, it's as much as you can get in the international scene. Settlements are illegal, hence any expansion of them is by definition illegal. But that's one of the preconditions. Actually, the U.S. position on this is interesting. In the early years, this is an issue since 1967, in the early years, the U.S. agreed that the settlements are illegal. Under Reagan, that was changed, to what was called an obstacle to peace. Under Obama, it's been weakened even further. Now it's not helpful to peace. So we've gone from illegal, what the world agrees and the international institutions, to an obstacle, to not helpful, and in fact the U.S. vetoed the resolution calling for expansion of them, okay? Calling for an end to expansion of them. Well, that's the first precondition. Second precondition is that the United States run the negotiations. The United States is not a neutral broker. It's a participant. The U.S. is a participant in the conflict on the part of Israel. It's not obscure. To say that the U.S. should run the negotiations is like saying that if there's a Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq, Iran should be the negotiator because they're a neutral partner. Everyone would laugh, of course, because they're on one side. But it's the same here. In fact, since 1976, so over 35 years, the United States has been blocking the two-state consensus. First case was January 1976, when a standard two-state resolution was brought to the Security Council by the Arab states, by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. The U.S. vetoed it. I won't run through the rest of the record, but it's been pretty much the same since. So to call for the U.S. to be the in charge of the negotiations, it was almost a guarantee that there can't be much authentic diplomacy, at least until U.S. rejectionism is reversed. And that could happen, but it's going to require big changes internal to the United States. What about the idea that there are two options? That's simply false. There are three options. One option is the two-state settlement that the whole world except the U.S. and Israel agree on. A second option is that Israel will take over the whole territory, which of course will never do because of the demographic problem. And there's a third option, which is unmentioned, that Israel will continue doing exactly what it is doing right now with U.S. support, which is not obscure. You can read about it day by day. It's taking over the parts of the West Bank that it finds valuable. I won't run through them because there's no time, but they're well established. It's a region which has very few Arabs, and the Arabs who are there are mostly being kicked out. And day by day, Arab villages are being demolished, and Palestinians are being driven out, wells are being sunk, settlements are established. So it'll be a region which has anything that's of value, very few Arabs, ultimately annexed to Israel, presumably, no demographic problem, no civil rights struggle. That's all pie in the sky. That's the third option. It's taking place right in front of our eyes, and that's the real alternative to a two-state settlement. Well, that's the Israel-Palestine negotiations. I urge you to look into it. Let's turn to two more things I want to talk about, but let's turn briefly to Syria. As you know, Syria agreed to abide by the Chemical Weapons Convention. I mean, it's claimed regularly in the press and by the president and so on that Syria finally agreed that it has chemical weapons under U.S. threat. In fact, Syria had announced quite some time ago that it has chemical weapons, and almost everyone understands why. They're intended to be a counter to Israeli nuclear weapons. Israel's the only nuclear-armed state, but it does have chemical weapons. There is a chemical weapons convention, which Syria has not signed or ratified. Actually, Israel hasn't ratified them either. The convention calls for banning of the production, storage, and use of chemical weapons. Now, those of you who listened to President Obama's national address will recall that he partially quoted the convention, partially. He said the convention calls for banning the use of chemical weapons. It's not quite true. It calls for banning the production, storage, and use of chemical weapons. There's a reason why Obama avoided production and storage and why the media followed him in doing this. Israel produces and stores chemical weapons, and the U.S. is not going to permit the convention to apply to its ally and client. So that's, but it could be applied. In fact, this would be a perfect moment to try to apply the Chemical Weapons Convention in its entirety to the Middle East. The best way of doing it would be to reconvene the international conference that the U.S. canceled last December, but more narrowly, just chemical weapons be a great moment to initiate an effort to ban chemical weapons in the Middle East under the convention. That's a straightforward way of doing that. You could renew a resolution that was brought to the Security Council of the United Nations in 2002, which called for imposing a chemical weapons convention on the Middle East. Now, that resolution was brought by Syria, which was then a member of the Security Council. It was blocked by the United States, which did not want the convention imposed because it would interfere with U.S. plans to invade Iraq. In fact, in the very same year, 2002, the U.S. intervened to force the head of the Chemical Weapons Convention, Brazilian Ambassador Bustani, to force him out of his position because he was, and it had enough coercive power to get the convention, the UN to throw him out. The reason was he was too vigorous in trying to impose a chemical weapons convention on the Middle East, and the US didn't want that. That was 2002, so that's a way to pursue it. But the real approach that should be taken right now, the narrow approach, is simply using this great opportunity to renew the Syrian proposal of 2002 to impose the convention on the region and to go beyond to imposing a banning of all weapons of mass destruction from the region and indeed others. Well, that's Syria. One final comment on another issue that's all over the front pages. It's the Snowden-Manning revelations, harshly condemned. Many support them, I should say, Snowden and Manning, and they should. But there's plenty of harsh condemnation, and it's very interesting to think it through. The condemnation is that it harms U.S. security. Okay, you hear that over and over. They're harming U.S. security, and we can't allow that. There's two problems with this. One is that when a state claims security pretexts, it literally carries no information. Whatever a state does, if somebody doesn't like it, they say security. It's totally predictable. Try it. Almost always. When a message is totally predictable, it carries no information. I mean, even in the technical sense of information, but even in the informal sense. So it means nothing. You have to ask, is it really protecting security? Because just to say it is just to repeat what every state says always. Well, there's a way of looking into that. It's supposed to be security against terror. Does the U.S. care about security against terror? Well, that's easy to evaluate. First of all, President Obama himself is carrying out the largest, by far the largest global terrorism campaign in the world. That's what the drone campaign is. It's a terrorist campaign. But beyond that, the terrorist campaign is generating terrorists, and they know it. It's explained in high places that when you bomb, when you terrorize a region with drones, you're creating future jihadis. And that happens constantly. So, for example, I'm in Boston. You remember the Boston Marathon bombing a couple of months ago. A couple of days after the Boston Marathon bombing, there was a drone attack in Yemen on a village. Usually we don't hear anything about those things. Now, this time, by accident, we did. There was a young man from the village who was in the United States, and he actually testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Testimony was interesting. He pointed out that for years, the jihadis in Yemen had been trying to convince his remote village to join in the anti-American campaign, but they refused because they didn't know anything about the United States except what he told them, and he liked the United States, so they had a favorable opinion. He said one drone attack, which murdered a man who could easily have been apprehended, and probably others, turned the whole village into people who hate America and will soon be providing future jihadis. That happens constantly, and it's known. It's a terror-generating campaign. But it's a lot worse than that, a lot worse. And for those of you who want to think about it, I urge that you read another article in the professional international relations literature, the current issue of Britain's leading journal of international relations. It's an article on the threat that drones pose to the West. What it points at, the article discusses something which should be obvious when you think about it. When you develop a technology to terrorize and massacre others, sooner or later they're going to use it against you. That happens consistently over history. And the author points out that drones are a perfect terror weapon. Just to cite one example, I'll quote, he says, right now, you can buy what's called a quadcopter, small drone, commercially available drone. You can buy it for $300 through mail order. It has real-time video streaming to a smartphone, which is controlled through an app. So you can buy for $300 on the internet a small drone, remotely controlled, which will have video surveillance. It means any terrorist can do it too. Once you get to video surveillance, pretty soon you get to lethal options as well. The U.S. drones, Predator and others, were originally for surveillance. Very quickly they turned into murder machines. That's going to happen. And this is right now. The robotics is improving rapidly. It's anticipated in the technical journals that pretty soon there'll be fly-sized drones, undetectable virtually, which can penetrate your house, let's say, and be up on the ceiling somewhere, carrying out surveillance, maybe ultimately equipped with lethal equipment. Now, that's in the offing, and terrorists will quickly pick it up. It's a perfect terrorist weapon, and we're creating a system in which we will be subjected to extremely efficient and very cheap terrorist weapons which will be used against us. That's what happens when you develop advanced military technology to terrorize people. And there's nothing new about it. You should look into the history. It's highly illuminating. Governments, you study international relations and so on, you learn that the highest priority of governments is security. It's just not true. Governments don't care much about security. They have other goals. Security is a low priority. And consistently, states risk security for other goals. It's not just security from terror, but even security from total destruction. So take a look at the history of nuclear weapons. Very interesting. There's good scholarly work on it. I urge you to read it. The major study is by McGeorge Bundy, who was a national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson. And he was given access to very high-level documents, to virtually everything. And he wrote a very comprehensive history of U.S. nuclear strategy. He has a small, 3 or 4 lines, which are the most interesting part of the book. It's kind of hidden in the whole book. He points out that in 1950, the United States had almost total security, overwhelming military power, controlled the whole hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. There was one potential threat. It was just potential at the time. ICBMs with advanced nuclear weapons, hydrogen bomb warheads. That didn't exist at the time. It just as tiny murderous drones don't exist now. But they were coming. He pointed out that the U.S. was, it's known, he didn't have to point it out, the U.S. is far ahead of the Russians in this technology. There was a window of opportunity to try to reach a treaty with the Russians, who might have agreed, because they were so far behind, a treaty that would ban the development of ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. And Bundy points out that he was unable to find even a paper, even a staff paper, raising the possibility of pursuing an option that could have preserved the United States from total destruction. And then he goes on to another topic. But that's pretty typical of the way states look at security. It is simply not a high-level concern. They have other concerns. There are power systems, other concerns, not the security of the population. Easy to run through the history to show this over and over. We're facing it right now with the drone terror campaign, which will sooner or later be turned against us. Well, that's a small sample of things that are on the front pages, but are also not on the front pages, because what's being presented to the public is a version of reality which, whatever you think its reasons are, has the property of marginalizing the public, preventing the public from participating in any meaningful way in formation of policy on any of the major issues of the day. And those are things that should not be tolerated, and in fact need not be tolerated. Thanks.
We're going to be moving on to the question and answer session. We only have a brief amount of time, so please keep your questions succinct and to the point so our speaker can answer as many of them as possible.
All right. Noam, thanks for coming. You've mentioned quite a few contradictions from the media and their presentation on things. And I think the most notorious case of this is with September 11th, 2001. You mentioned in a forum on ZNet in 2006 that you wanted to see a consensus of engineers and specialists that understand the actual structures of these buildings and their possible collapse. And there is such a group, and I'm here to tell you about that and ask you a follow-up question. It's called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. There's a consensus of over 2,000 of them.
All right, is this a question or
Please
a
don't
statement?
interrupt. I'm asking a question. I'm setting it up. Thank you. This consensus shows that Building 7, the third building that fell on 9/11, fell in free fall speed, as this report acknowledges. Are you ready to come forward and jump on board with 9/11? I know you've mentioned it's a distraction, but there's no better case of the media covering up things than not presenting Building 7, that third building. We've all seen the other towers fall, but what about Building 7, Noam?
Well, in fact, you're right that there's a consensus among a minuscule number of architects and engineers, tiny number. A couple of them are perfectly serious. They are not doing what scientists and engineers do when they think they've discovered something. What you do, when you think you've discovered something, what you do is write articles in scientific journals, give talks at the professional societies, go to the civil engineering department at MIT or Florida or wherever you are, and present your results, and then proceed to try to convince the national academies, the professional society of physicists and civil engineers, the departments in the major universities, convince them that you've discovered something. Now, there happen to be a lot of people around who spent an hour on the internet and think they know a lot of physics, but it doesn't work like that. There's a reason why there are, there's a reason, may I finish? There's a reason why there are graduate schools in these departments and research. So the thing to do is pretty straightforward. Do what scientists and engineers do who think they've made a discovery. Now, when this is brought up, as it has been, there are one or two minor articles, Like there's one article that appeared in an online journal which claims to have found, where someone claims to have found traces of nanothermite in Building 7. I don't know what that means. You don't know what that means. But if it means anything, bring it to the attention of the scientific community. That's a couple of other fragments like that. So yes, there's a small group of people who believe this, and there's a straightforward way to proceed. Now, when this is brought up, there's a standard reaction. Scientists and engineers and professional societies and physicists are so intimidated by the government that they're afraid to they don't have the courage to take this position. Anyone who has any any familiarity with political activism knows that this is one of the safest things you can do. It's almost riskless. People take risks far beyond this constantly, including scientists and engineers. I can have run through and can run through many examples. I mean, it's a kind of maybe people will laugh at you, but that's about it. It's an almost riskless position. So that can't be the reason why nobody's convinced. However, there's a much more deeper issue, which has been brought up repeatedly, and I have yet to hear a response to it. There happens to be, whatever one thinks about Building 7, frankly, I have no opinion. I don't know as much science and engineering as the people who believe that they have an answer to this. So I am willing to let the professional societies determine it if they get the information. So whatever the facts, there's just overwhelming evidence that the Bush administration wasn't involved. Very elementary evidence. You don't have to be a physicist to understand it. You just have to think for a minute, okay? So let's think for a minute. There's a couple of facts which are uncontroversial, right? One fact that is uncontroversial is that the Bush administration desperately wanted to invade Iraq. That's a long-standing goal. There's good reasons for it. Second largest energy resources in the world, right in the middle of the world's major energy-producing region. Perfectly obvious reasons, which they in fact later stated, but they were obvious anyway. So they wanted to invade Iraq. One uncontroversial fact. Second uncontroversial fact. They didn't blame the 9/11 on Iraqis. They blamed it on Saudis, mainly. That's their major ally. So they blamed it on people from their major ally, not on the country that they wanted to invade. The third uncontroversial fact. Unless they're total lunatics, they would have blamed it on Iraqis if they were involved in any way. That would have given them open season on invading Iraq. Total support, international support, the UN resolution, no need to concoct wild stories about the weapons of mass destruction and contacts between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, which of course quickly exploded, discrediting them. No reason to invade Afghanistan, which was mostly a waste of time for them. But they didn't. Well, the conclusion is pretty straightforward. Either they are total lunatics or they weren't involved, and they're not total lunatics. So whatever you think about Building 7, there are other considerations to be concerned with.
All right, I think our speaker answered that question succinctly, so that's the only question we'll have on that topic.
Hi, good evening. From a fellow Lancer from Central High School, 218th class. If there's any others in here, they can raise their hands.
If you don't know, that's where I graduated, much to my regret.
At any rate, I want to bring up something called the Oded-Yanon Plan that goes back about 40 years now, or no, early 1983, so 30 years. Oded-Yanon.
Oded-Yanon, oh yeah.
It was a plan that was a plan to destabilize the Middle East, break up the countries into smaller pieces, and on a few days after 9/11, actually, Wesley Clark visited the Pentagon and was given some information on this plan of 7 countries in 5 years, which kind of, if you read Oded Yinon and look at the 7 countries and what's happened since 9/11, 2001, and March 19th, 2003, they pretty much coincide. They also coincide with something called the Clean Break and the Project for the New American Century. I'd like to hear what you have to say on that.
Well, Oded Yinon was I think a Jewish agency official who did publish this plan in must have been 1981, because I remember writing about it in some detail in a book that came out in 1983, Fateful Triangle. So if you want, you can look up what I said there. It was kind of like an offbeat proposal, which is discussed there and had no influence. It probably represented the thinking of some right-wing extremist section of the Israeli kind of political establishment. That was Yinon's proposal. Discussed it there, so I won't repeat it. Clark did make this statement. Who knows what it meant? No doubt that the U.S. would be quite interested, and has been interested back since the 1940s, in controlling the Middle East countries and their energy resources. You can find much stronger evidence than Clark's offhand comment. So back in the 1940s, for example, when the U.S. was kind of in the process of displacing England and running the world, the State Department described the Middle East oil-producing regions as a spectacular source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Other advisors, like A. Burley, one of Roosevelt's main advisors, pointed out that if we can control the Middle East, we can control the world. George Kennan, one of the top planners, pointed out that if we can control Middle East oil, we'll have veto power over other countries, including our allies. It was pretty much repeated by Zbigniew Brzezinski at the time of the invasion of Iraq. So there's plenty of straightforward, high-level evidence, quite apart from policy, showing that, yes, the U.S. For decades has been committed to trying to control the Middle East energy resources. You don't have to use little tidbits of information to try to provide this. It's really not controversial. Now, this goes back to the discovery of oil well over a century ago, which at the time Britain was, the global dominant power, and they wanted to control the oil. France came in, the U.S. kind of horned in later, and then kind of pushed them all aside. So sure, that's been going on. But I don't, at least I'm not aware of anything that's really hidden about this. It all seems to be very open in the documentary record and the actual events.
All right, let's take a question from the balcony.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky. I was wondering if you might have any comments on the contemporary situation in sub-Saharan Africa generally, and the recent French intervention in the Central African Republic specifically.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Did you hear it?
Could you repeat that one time, please?
Yeah. Wait, closer or farther? Do you have any comments on the situation in sub-Saharan Africa generally? And sub-Saharan Africa, and the recent French intervention in the Central African Republic specifically?
Well, one thing that's happening, a lot of things are happening in Africa, of course. One thing that's happening is that the U.S. is creating a vast base system, small bases, small enough so they don't count as bases, but kind of mini bases all through Africa. There's a lot of very good work on this, particularly by Nick Turse, T-U-R-S-E. He's published a couple of important articles on it, just reviewing in considerable detail the expansion of U.S. bases throughout Africa, and kind of militarizing the continent. The French have been doing it in their own region, West Africa, for a long time, also in Djibouti, where there's a French base that the U.S. uses. So undoubtedly, the African continent is regarded as a major region where the traditional imperial powers want to reestablish control. By now, it used to be England and France mainly. Now it's mostly the U.S., France and England secondary. So sure, that's going on, and it has to do with African resources. It's kind of interesting to look at the history. So if you go back to the 1940s, when the U.S., the peak of U.S. power, in fact of any power in world history, was in 1945. There's a lot of talk about American decline, but it's worth remembering it's been declining since 1945, steady process. 1945, the U.S. just had overwhelming power. It literally had half the world's wealth. Other industrial countries had been devastated or severely harmed. The U.S. economy boomed during the war. Industrial production virtually quadrupled. The U.S. already had been the richest country in the world for a long time. At the end of the Second World War, it was just overwhelming. It had overwhelming security, I already mentioned that. And the U.S. planners knew it. They developed detailed plans for how to organize the world in the interests of, basically in the interests of what they called the U.S. economy. That means U.S. corporate power. And they elaborate, sensible plans. Each region of the world was assigned what was called its function within this overall system that would be dominated by the United States. So the function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials to the former imperial powers so that they could gain dollars for which they could use to buy American production. The U.S. had a huge surplus of production. Nobody could buy it. That would be the way the former imperial powers would reconstruct and within the American system and purchase American goods. It was called the dollar gap, big issue. And every region of the world was assigned its role. This was mostly done by George Kennan and his policy planning staff for the State Department. And it was all implemented. These are actually plans that go back to wartime meetings and discussions, a lot of documentation on it. What about Africa? When Kennan ran through the areas of the world and he got to Africa, he said, we're not much interested in Africa. This is the 1940s. He said, Africa's of no interest to us. Therefore, we should give Africa to the Europeans for them to exploit. His word, not mine. We should give Africa to the Europeans to exploit for their own reconstruction. Okay? You can think of a different relation between Europe and Africa considering the history, but of course that never came to anyone's mind. So then the idea was, fine, the Europeans can exploit it, we don't care. Over the years that changed. In more recent years, the U.S. has become much more interested in African resources, particularly oil, but also minerals and much more. And now it's no longer for the Europeans to exploit. We have to exploit it too. Chinese are in there. They want to exploit it their own way. One of the effects of the Libya invasion, probably one of its goals, was to drive China out. China had about 30,000 technicians working in Libya in the oil industry and other industries, and of course they had to flee. And there's a lot of conflict going on about who's going to dominate and control Africa, and by now the U.S. wants to make sure that it's in the lead. So that's what the military basing is about. I'm not sure whether this is the particular question you were asking, but these things are definitely happening. You should keep an eye on them. This guy, Nick Terse, who I mentioned, is probably doing the best work on it.
All right, I think we just have time for two final questions. We'll take one from that line over there.
Hi, Hi, I actually got up because I noticed that there was no women at all in any of the lines, and I feel like that's really unfortunate. I wish that there were more. Really, my question to you, Mr. Chomsky, is the media prism that you talk about. I mean, it not only affects foreign policy, although I do think that it pervades foreign policy, but obviously we see a part of our domestic policy, you know, the Tea Party caucus is a perfect example that, in my opinion, live in a very different reality than I do. And maybe because they do watch media that is not the media that I watch, or read very different media, it's not the media that I read, I think that has contributed to incredible divisiveness in our politics, and I'm wondering what you think that we can do to speak to maybe our family members or colleagues or people who are watching or are sort of sheltered in this media prism, and really they're living in a different reality than we are, maybe believing that there is no such thing as, you know, the debt ceiling, and nothing's going to happen if, you know, we just continue playing politics and taking the entire country hostage just to go into an ideological sinking ship. So I'm wondering what your suggestions are.
Well, I think that's an important point. There's a tendency, which I'm prone to myself, so I can easily understand it, and that's just to ridicule it. I mean, it's so off the wall, you know. The world is just, can't believe it. You go anywhere in the world, people think the United States has gone insane, you know, literally. The comment I mentioned from the Chinese commentator this morning is typical. So it's easy to just ridicule it, but you have to think about where it comes from. This is a very strange country. And it's been so for a long time. For one thing, the country is still fighting the Civil War. Take a look at the last election, and look at the, take a look at the red and blue states. It's the Civil War, you know. If you go back to the Civil War, it was never over. The South has never accepted defeat in the Civil War. A state like, say, Mississippi, which gets more federal subsidies than any state in the country, there's plenty of people in Mississippi who are saying, okay, I'll be willing to starve to death if we can destroy Washington, okay? Because we're still fighting the Civil War. Now, you know that here firsthand, I'm sure. It's all over the South. And a large part of what's going on is just that this has affected U.S. politics dramatically. I mean, the U.S. has never developed sort of class-based politics. I mean, most of the world doesn't either, but it does to some extent. So there are labor parties and so on in other countries, not here. One of the reasons, main reasons, is that right after the Civil War, what developed was sectional politics. The slogan was, you vote where you shoot, right? So there was a Southern politics and a Northern Republican politics. Then the Southern was Democrat and the Northern was Republican. Now they've changed the names, but it's the same politics. And the sectional politics just dominated throughout. Any effort to develop mass popular democratic movements in the United States was undermined by the sectional character of politics. So it's kind of hard to remember, but the most significant radical democratic popular movement in the country's history started in Texas. It was the Farmers Alliance back around 1870, 1880. This was an alliance of independent farmers who were being crushed by merchants, New England banks, you know, the monopolists who monopolized grain and so on. And it spread very widely, spread all over the Midwest, massive popular movement, very radical in its goals. They're really trying to create a popular democratic republic which would free itself from monopoly control, banking control, and so on. It began to link up with the Knights of Labor, the mass labor movement that developed in the 19th century, which was pretty radical. They thought workers should take over factories and run them. These were all mass movements. They were nothing like it in American history since or before. They were finally crushed by a combination of state and corporate violence. But one of the things that crushed them was sectional politics, racism and sectional politics. It has been a curse in the United States from 1620, when the first slaves came. We've never gotten out of it. The black population is still partially enslaved. That's not a joke. It's it's just a major curse. Another issue has to do with your first comment. You think it's time for a woman to say something. Take a look at the history of women in the United States or Britain or any other country. At the time of the founding of the country, women were not persons. They were property. The United States took over British common law. Under British common law, a woman was the property of her father and transferred to her husband, And it pretty much stayed like that for a long time. It was literally not until 1975 that a Supreme Court judgment determined that women were peers. They could serve on a federal jury, okay? It's a few years ago. Now, the feminist revolution has made a lot of progress. Things have changed a lot, but it's very striking to see how some things haven't changed, like the proportion of women and men in the lines over there hasn't changed. And that's very striking. It's very significant. It's another dividing line that prevents things from happening. Another fact about the United States is it has always been an extremely frightened country. This goes back to the colonists again. That's part of the reason for the crazed gun culture. We got to have guns to save ourselves from the UN or aliens or whoever's coming. But this goes way back, and you can't laugh at it. It's deeply rooted. There's actually an interesting study of it in popular literature by a very good literary critic, Bruce Franklin, who looks at popular literature from the colonial times up to the present. Now it's TV, but and there are a couple of themes that are consistent. This reaches the mass public. One theme is that we're under attack. We're about to be destroyed by some extraordinary force, and at the last minute, we're saved by a super weapon or superhero in modern times. Teenage kids going up into the hills and driving out the Russians and whatever it may be. But it's a common theme. And there's a kind of a sub-theme, which is that the force that's trying to destroy us is somebody we're destroying. So in the early days, it was the Indians. And incidentally, this is right in the Declaration of Independence. The people intone it every year, but try reading it sometimes. One of the charges against, this is Thomas Jefferson, the great Enlightenment figure. There's a bill of indictment against the King of England, and one part of it is he unleashed against us the merciless Indian savages, whose known way of warfare is, torture and murder and so on. I mean, Jefferson was there. He knew perfectly well it was the murderous English savages who were doing most of this and initiating it. But it was reversed, just as it's always reversed. The people we're exterminating and driving out, they're the ones who are about to destroy us. They're merciless savages. Later it becomes the slaves. There was deep concern always, all throughout the South, all the slave-owning areas, that the slaves are going to rise up. Actually, there's so many of them. How can we control them? That's one reason we have to have guns, and we have to have whips and so on. Because what they really want to do is rise up, kill us all, rape all the white women, take over the country. So we got to crush them, Later in the century, it became Chinese coolies. Chinese, what they called coolies, were being brought in to build the railroads and do all kind of horrible work. And there was stories began about how they're really infiltrating the country with the plan of taking us over and destroying us. And it just goes on like that to the present. Hispanic narco-traffickers, Arab terrorists, one thing after another. And that's a deep-rooted sentiment in the country. It does lie behind the gun culture, among other things. Well, there's a lot more. Another thing is it's an extraordinarily religious country, way off the spectrum internationally. There's just no other country in the world where almost half the population thinks the world was created a couple thousand years ago. I mean, that's unheard of in other countries. And it's on issue after issue. Well, you know, and you can't laugh about it. I think your point is quite right. You have to take it seriously. These are people with real fears, real beliefs, real concerns. You may, in some corner of your mind, think this is crazy. But when people sincerely believe something and feel it, you can't just laugh it off. So it has to be approached almost like therapy, sympathetically, an effort to understand where the people are coming from, sympathize with them, try to help them out of what in fact is a kind of pathology. And it's all over the culture. And I don't think these things can be dismissed. I think your point is quite right.
Hello. Thank you.
We'll take one last final question from the line on the right.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky, for taking my question. Questions about the debt ceiling. It's become increasingly obvious that we're in a lot of trouble here. And it's also becoming obvious to everyone that the Federal Reserve Bank that issues the currency is owned by a bunch of private bankers. So my question to you is, do you think it would remedy the situation at all to return the power of printing money and issuing currency to the people of the United States?
Frankly, there's a lot of feeling about that, but I really think it's misguided. I don't think the problem is printing fiat currency. That's, I mean, just in I mean, if you eliminate capitalism, you know, okay, then there are other options. But that's not on the agenda. We have a state capitalist economy, you know, maybe in the long term it can be worn away, maybe overthrown, I hope so. But the issue now is how do you function in a sensible state capitalist economy? And you cannot do that without a central bank that controls currency. In fact, if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve's ability to print money, we'd be in a deep depression right now, a worse depression than the 1930s. And what's, you know, since the sensible thing isn't being done for political reasons, the sensible thing would be creating demand by government investment. But for reasons that we can go into, that's not being done. In our state capitalist economy, the only alternative is the one that Bernanke has used. And if it wasn't for their option, we would be in a deep depression. Now, what's the debt ceiling issue? Well, that's, first of all, it should be recognized that the debt is not a serious problem. Certainly the deficit is not a serious problem. There are long-term problems about the debt, but they are so remote they don't bear on policy. As far as the deficit is concerned, remember, that's not the same as the debt. As Clinton left office, it's not that long ago, we had a surplus, no deficit. I mean, it's not a deep structural problem. The current deficit is the result of Bush's tax cut, the crazy wars, the virtually criminal behavior of the corporate system that led to the housing crisis, finally financial crisis. All of that has increased the deficit, but not out of sight. The deficit is, first of all, it's declining, and it would be overcome by actual growth. I mean, the government economic offices, Bureau of the Budget and so on, they calculate that there's about $1 trillion of unused capacity. I mean, the real problem of the economy is not the debt and the deficit. It's the fact that the economy is so kind of grotesque that you have tens of millions of people wanting to work and not able to. You have huge financial resources, the corporations that don't know what to do with their money, huge profits, huge bank profits. There's an enormous amount that has to be done. Just walk around any city, you can think of a million things that have to be done, and all kinds, just enumerate them at will. So a huge number of idle hands, enormous resources, tremendous amount of work that has to be done, and the economy is so dysfunctional it can't put them together. That's the problem. And it's destroying a generation of young people. It's severely harming the economy. Under current circumstances, the way out is pretty well known. It's to stimulate the economy through government demand, since corporations aren't doing it, and to devalue the dollar so that we import less and export more. These are methods that are technically feasible, but not politically feasible. And I think we have to ask about that. So what's the dysfunction in government about? Well, for one thing, it's called polarization of the parties. That's just not accurate. I mean, think about what's happened in the United States. You go back about 50 years, and the United States was described, not incorrectly, as a one-party state, the business party, with two factions called Democrats and Republicans. And that was pretty accurate. But something changed. No time to talk about it, but in the last roughly generation, 30, 35 years, there's been a significant change in the economy, and it's led to a change in the political organizations. We're still a one-party state, the business party. We still have two factions, but they're not Democrats and Republicans. One faction is moderate Republicans who are called Democrats. So the Democrats today are pretty much the moderate Republicans of a generation ago. People say the moderate Republicans have disappeared. No, they haven't. They've just become Democrats. And the other faction was mobile. As the two parties drifted to the right, the Republicans just went off the edge. They became the party of the very rich and the corporate sector. Well, you can't get votes that way. So they were compelled to turn to the kinds of sectors of the population that I was describing before, which were always there, but were not mobilized as a political force. The people terrified that somebody's coming after them, the religious extremists, the people who hate science because what do those guys know, and so on and so forth. Those are the sectors that's the base of the Republican Party. And that's the second faction. If you look at the business pages now, the corporate sector is very concerned that they can't control their base. They can no longer control them. These guys don't care if they destroy the economy. Who cares? We can win the Civil War, God will help us, whatever it is. They just don't care. And it's a very unusual situation. But that's the rough political system in the United States. There's some counterparts. It's kind of similar to something that happened in late Weimar Germany, when the German industrialists thought that they could use the Nazis as a battering ram against labor and the left, and they figured then they could control them. Turned out they couldn't. They couldn't control them. And you know what happened. This is not Weimar Germany, but there's a striking similarity. And that's the dysfunction. That's what's happening in Washington. That's why the World Bank and the IMF are pleading with the United States to try to act like a civilized society, because we may bring down the global economy with these two factions. That's a serious problem. Florida's right in the middle of it, so you guys see it all around you.
All right, well, that's all the questions we have time for. Please be sure to check out some of the tables and groups tabling in the lobby on your way out. There's still lots of great literature, lots of great upcoming events, and thank you for being here with us tonight.